Hi, this is Josh Kulp. We are learning Daf Shevui, Masechet Avodah Zarah. We are on Daf Mem Vav, page 46. You may have noticed that my beard is a little shorter than it was last week. I did cave into my wife and shaved most of my beard. The scruff is starting to grow back because it's still the Omer. I shaved on Yom Ha'atzmaut, which I think is a good thing to do. So my wife's happy. I miss my beard, and you can let me know on Facebook what you think if you are watching this video. In any case, to get down to the heart of the matter, what is this daf all about? And I would characterize this daf as being a series of theoretical questions or questions about things that sound practical and are really meant to illustrate some abstract thinking that lies behind the kind of question, abstract principles, which if you think of it is very typical of rabbinic literature. Rabbinic literature usually doesn't talk in abstracts, or certainly the Amoraim and the Tanaim less frequently talk in abstracts. And what we're trying to do is use their concrete discussions about concrete cases to tease out principles that could be applied to other cases. That's largely what the Stam does. That's the anonymous voice in the Gemara, and it's largely what the commentators do, and it's what we're going to do on this daf too, and you'll be able to see it. So I'll just show you a few examples. The first question is asked about rocks or boulders, I've translated, they're probably bigger than these little rocks, that come apart from a mountain. We know that if a mountain is worshipped, the mountain doesn't become prohibited because the mountain is a natural feature attached to the ground, and things that attach to the ground cannot become prohibited as idols, except for a tree. But the question over here just says, does an idol have to be made by a person? A boulder that's becomes detached from the ground on its own was not constructed by a person, but just is something that was detached on its own. And really, I think the Amoraim here are asking the question of, or what's the problem with an idol? Is it that it was worshipped? Or is it that it was constructed by a human being in order to be worshipped? And the test case is something that was worshipped but was not constructed by a human being. It's a little bit like a tree. If a tree was planted, that's in a sense constructed. So if a person, an idolater, plants a tree for it to become idolatrous, then that tree was sort of created in a sense by a human in order to be an idol. But a rock that comes detached from the ground, a human being didn't do anything to it. Can that idol become prohibited, or does the idol have to be made by a human being? There is a midrashic analogy here that I want to explain. The technique is called Hatzad HaShaveh. And basically is when you have, let's say, A is unknown, but you know the rule with B and C. And then someone says, well, if the rule is B, then it must be with A because B is like A. And then someone says, no, B is not so much like A. And then someone says, well, that rule applies to C. C is like A, and therefore it should apply to A too. And someone says, no, C is also not like A. So now you have B and C that are not like A, but if they're a little bit like A, like part of it, partly like A, you might say B and C are different from each other, but they have one similarity. They share that similarity with A, and therefore you can use B and C to derive the rule from A. If you didn't like all that sort of logic, then sorry, I like that kind of logical thinking. That's what this kind of midrashic argument is about, and you'll see it on the daf. The next question is similar. It's about setting up an egg to worship it as an idol. An egg is something natural. Human beings didn't create the egg, but they worshipped it. So can something that was a natural feature human beings didn't create, can it become an idol? That we know is true, but does the human being erecting it, that's the real question here, does the human being erecting the egg, putting it up, I don't know, on his mantelpiece, for instance, to worship it, does that count as making it? Right? In other words, if we need human beings to make the idol, then what counts as making an idol? Does just taking something natural and putting it in a place, I don't know, setting it up on a stand, for instance, count enough? Or does it actually have to be modified in and of itself? Scramble the egg, for instance, and then worship. I like scrambled eggs, but I do not worship my scrambled eggs. Anyway, that's the question. The next couple of cases have to do with a more elevated use, and that's use in the temple. For instance, the first question is asked about rocks that became separate and were worshipped, a mountain that was worshipped, and then rocks became separated from it. Now we know that those rocks are permitted because the worshiping of the mountain meant nothing. The rocks themselves were not worshipped. But now someone wants to know, is there a little bit of an idolatrous nature that sort of adheres to these rocks, and therefore you couldn't use them to build the altar in the temple? It's an extreme case, but really the kind of thing they're trying to ask is saying, look, we know these rocks are not considered idols. Jews can use them because the goy worshiping the mountain doesn't make the mountain prohibited. We know that. But is there just a little reach, in Hebrew we would say, a little whiff of idolatry that adheres to them, and therefore they can't be used in the temple? The same question is asked about a stalk of wheat that is worshipped. Somebody bows down to a stalk of wheat attached to the ground. That stalk of wheat is attached to the ground and doesn't become prohibited. A Jew could cut down that wheat and use it to his heart's delight, make grain, make flour, bread, whatever he wants with it, no problem. But could you use that grain, grind it up, and serve it as a mincha, a grain offering on the altar? In other words, again, is there a little bit of idolatry that adheres to this item, or is it permitted to Jews and permitted to the temple the same? Those are the kinds of sort of abstract questions based on concrete examples that our sugya brings up. I find it an interesting page, although I admit it is very sort of heavy, intellectual, theoretical kind of page of Talmud. I hope you enjoy, and as always, please ask questions on our Facebook group.